It is the biggest assault on a European state since World War II. Russia's attack on its neighbor was predicted but not prevented. How did it come to this, and do Western powers have a strategy to help Ukraine beyond sanctions? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is the Russian offensive in Ukraine. The West warned for months that Russia was building up a massive force near Ukrainian territory. And for weeks, the Kremlin denied it had any plans to cross the border. But on Thursday, Moscow indeed launched a military operation on a scale not seen in Europe in decades. Many have been left wondering, how was it possible for Western powers to know so much and yet not be able to stop it from happening? On the show, we will discuss whether publicizing Moscow's plans was really the right strategy from the White House. Could a different course of action have deterred Putin, or was an attack always a foregone conclusion? Russia's president, speaking after the first day of the operation, said he was left with no choice after the West ignored its concerns.
Everything that is happening is a desperate measure. They left us no other option. They've created such security risks that we couldn't react differently. All the attempts failed. To be honest, I'm even surprised. We couldn't advance an inch on any of the questions.
Now, the United Nations exists to maintain international peace and security. But that clearly is not happening in this case. UN agencies are predicting up to 5 million Ukrainians could be forced to flee to surrounding countries. The UN chief says Russia's actions are a gross violation of international law.
The use of force by one country against another is the repudiation of the principles that every country has committed to uphold. And this applies to the present military offensive. It is wrong. It is against the Charter, it is unacceptable, but it is not irreversible. I repeat my appeal from last night to President Putin. Stop the military operation. Bring the troops back to Russia. We know the toll of war. With death rising, we are seeing images of fear, anguish, and terror in every corner of Ukraine. People, everyday innocent people, always pay the highest price. That is why the United Nations is scaling up our humanitarian operations in and around Ukraine. Today, I'm announcing that we'll immediately allocate $20 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to meet urgent needs. We and our humanitarian partners are committed to staying and delivering to support people in Ukraine at their time of need.
But Ukraine is not exactly feeling the support. Ukrainian President Zelenskyy has accused European leaders of abandoning his country, saying they are too scared to commit to Ukraine's protection.
Today, I have asked 27 European leaders whether Ukraine will be in NATO. I have asked directly. Everyone is afraid. No one answers. But we are not afraid. We are not afraid of anything. We are not afraid to defend our country. We are not afraid of Russia. We are not afraid to talk to Russia. We are not afraid to talk about anything, about security guarantees for our country. We are not afraid of talking about neutrality. We are not NATO members at the moment. But what guarantees will we get? And most importantly, which countries will give us those guarantees?
Well, Western leaders responding to the attack seemed keen to emphasize what they were not able to guarantee. NATO made it clear they would not be sending troops to fight on Ukraine's behalf. And while the European Union and the United States imposed tougher economic measures on Russia, they did not personally sanction President Putin himself, nor cut Russia off the global financial system. The Biden administration was also quick to dismiss a report that it was weighing up cyber warfare. But the US president said its measures would still take a toll.
And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO.
I'm joined now from the road outside Kiev by Iuliia Mendel. She is the former spokesperson of Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. Yulia, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers today. I understand that you are leaving Kiev. Tell me, why did you take that decision?
Thank you for having me here. I took this decision. It was a very heavy decision, to be frank. We took it both today because we had a plan of actions in our minds if we see the danger. And we actually left Kiev just in an hour before the sabotage group joined the city from the north of the town. 2 days in a row, we woke up very early. Today it was at 4:20 a.m. because we heard shelling and bombing. Today, the bombing shelled a residential house and it was damaged. Fortunately, there were no killed people, but there were wounded people. What we know that Russians are targeting Kiev. This is the major target for Russians, so they try to get to Kiev from different directions, especially, of course, from the north and east. And when we were leaving, they were like around 50 kilometers from Kiev. After we left and were on a highway, like for an hour, we saw that there were 3 battles in the region of Kiev, very close to the place where we lived. We know that there is a hard battle right now. We follow the news. We had 2 sirens while we were at home, and then we saw our friends were sharing that they were keeping going to hide in the bomb shelters.
So,
yeah, so
Yulia,
the situation is very heavy.
Indeed, the situation is dire. Are you indicating that Kiev is not safe for civilians anymore?
I think it is not safe for anyone, for any human anymore today. We hope that the Ukrainian army will manage to cope with this aggression. We are sure that Ukrainian army does everything what is possible to do to fight against the aggressor, but we don't know how long the bombing will last. And as we never expected that Russia will ever bomb Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, we still do not know how far Putin will go to damage the country.
Indeed, still there are many uncertainties revolving around the war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, Yulia, you are a former spokesperson of Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. I'm sure you must have followed the standoff between Russia and Ukraine and much of the West very closely. I want to get your thoughts on whether or not you think the international community responded in an effective way to Russia.
This is a very tough question, and let me explain you very easily it. So there were shellings and damages in around 16 regions of Ukraine, 16 of 25 yesterday. We have very tough fights in the south, in the north, in the east. We have a lot of killed people and many more wounded people, and we really are struggling to fight back. The sanctions, meanwhile, we see that today the Russian markets rose 15% after the toughest sanctions were announced yesterday. And we really cannot understand how it can happen. We feel like that the offers that we make for the West, the requests that we ask very much, are very much needed, because the major target is not Ukraine.
Yulia, do you feel the
Actually,
West is not meeting your demands?
we ask for more. We need more action. We need to cut Russia from SWIFT system. We need to have sanctions against the National Bank of Russia. And we are asking for off-sky, no-fly sky, which means that if Russian airplanes will bomb Ukrainian cities, the Western airplanes can respond. We will fight on the ground with our soldiers, but we need these three actions. We need them to stay alive, to stand independent and sovereign.
All right, Iuliia Mendel, thank you very much for taking out the time to join us here on the Newsmakers today, and I would like to wish you all the best for your journey ahead.
Thank you for having me.
Let's discuss the broader geopolitics now. Joining us from Michigan is Ronald Suny. He is a professor of political science and history and has written many books on Russian nationalism and the Soviet Union. And in Canterbury, UK, is Richard Sakwa. He is a professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. He is the author of Frontline Ukraine and the Putin Paradox. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Ronald, I would like to begin with you. You heard what Yulia had to say. Ukrainians have more demands from the West. We're going to talk about in detail whether or not the West is ready to meet Ukrainians' demands. But first, let me ask you, if the West was so convinced that this was going to happen, do you think it did all it could to stop it from happening?
Clearly, it didn't do all it could do to stop it because it happened. We are now in an incredibly tragic situation with war on Ukrainian soil, with Putin invading the country, probably attempting to take Kiev and overthrow the government. So the question really is, were there alternatives to this? And I believe there were. I think there were efforts, particularly by President of France, Macron, to raise the issue of the so-called Minsk II protocols. There were ways to finesse this thing, to try to negotiate more thoroughly with Vladimir Putin. And I think a chance to prevent the war was definitely missed, I'm sorry to say.
Okay. Richard, let me come to you. I mean, we also have to talk about Russia, right? Over the past 3 months, I remember President Putin's statements from November and December. He had stated that Russia has no plans of attacking Ukraine. Yet here we are today, and Russia has attacked Ukraine. What I would like to ask you here is, did President Putin mislead the world with his statements?
Well, as Ronald said, clearly the outcome was not what he said it would be. But the bigger picture quite clearly is that from the end of last year, Putin decided to resolve one way or another that security dilemma, which the Moscow elite believed had been building up non-stop. And thus he, in December, put forwards 2 European Security Treaty drafts, 2 ideas of how to go forwards. It was a type of coercive diplomacy, yet he felt, look, they weren't listening to us. If you remember in his State of the Nation speech in 2018, he said, look, you didn't listen to us then, listen to us now. And they didn't listen. And so we had these security treaties. They were effectively not responded in any serious way. The response on the 26th of January was basically dismissive. And worse than that, not only were the ideas about no NATO enlargement and others dismissed, but the very idea of talking to Russia about it was considered illegitimate. So, we got to an escalatory cycle. Macron did indeed, and Scholz, the German chancellor, tried to achieve something. Macron has been saying for a long time that a European security order cannot be built against Russia. It must be with Russia. However, he failed, and this is a tragedy, to break through what I call this block discipline of NATO. Simply does not and has not for decades accepted any of Russia's major security concerns. This doesn't justify anything today, and I'm not saying that for 1 second, but I am arguing that the West bears a huge burden of responsibility for allowing the situation to spiral in this catastrophic direction. A huge burden.
Okay. Ron, I would like to get your response on this. Do you think the West largely ignored Russia's legitimate security concerns?
Oh, I think that's been going on for a long time. I think that some very, very prominent uh, international relations theorists like George Kennan, even Henry Kissinger, have warned over and over again that the expansion of NATO to the east, let's realize this is taking over the old Warsaw Bloc and even 3 republics of the former Soviet Union, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, that this is a threat to Russia, that Russia will find this unacceptable. It was done at a time during the Yeltsin years when Russia was quite weak. It protested, but it couldn't do much about it. But Putin made it clear very early on that this was unacceptable. So they've now gone for 20 plus years trying to change the situation. And the response from the West was only that we might, in fact, increase NATO. We have the right to increase NATO by bringing in Georgia and Ukraine. And we know what happened with the Georgian situation when Saakashvili...
I want to talk about that threat by the West a bit more in detail. But first, Ron, I would like to add one question here. Now, over the past 3 months, when Russia, especially when Russia started to hold these large-scale, massive military drills across the border with Ukraine, U.S. President Joe Biden was on the media pretty much every day issuing warnings that the U.S. has credible intelligence that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. And it happened, right? What I would like to ask you here is, do you think this strategy of issuing threats, do you think that was effective at all?
No, I think the guilt here is on both sides. This was an attempt by Putin to negotiate, I'll call it with a gun to the head. And nobody likes to respond that way. Now, there were chances. You had 4 months in which you could make adjustments and make concessions of some kind, make some assurances, take Putin more seriously, and that simply was not done. And we're in this tragic situation. So, Putin's particular method of trying to change the situation, I would say, was debilitating, dangerous, and we've seen what the result is. And the American hard line, in fact, produced nothing but now this invasion.
Okay, Richard. Now, I mean, there's certainly no point in talking about whether or not this could have been avoided, but I would like to ask you, do you think the West could have dealt with the situation in a better way?
Of course it could. One of the latest provocations, which I found shocking, was at the Munich Security Conference, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, warned, or in fact proclaimed, that Ukraine now desires to become a nuclear power state. And this has the technical capacity, it has short-range missiles. This was one of the most shocking things I've heard in years. And even more shocking was the fact that the world leaders virtually and in actual fact presence did not respond to this or slap him down. We've heard since February 2014 endless threats from Ukraine to pile the pressure on, to push against Russia, and it became an anti-Russian project, if you like, and it just didn't stop. Of course, we had Crimea, we had all sorts of things, the failure to implement Minsk, 4 million people living in the Donbass. So at every point, we just simply had an escalatory cycle in which, there was just simply no way in which this was going to stop, until finally we had these ultimatums and tried to get the discussions going. And of course, they didn't go anywhere.
Okay, now, gentlemen, I would like to move on to the next part of our discussion and talk about how can the international community stop what is happening in Ukraine. There are growing calls from Ukrainian politicians that the West should do more. But realistically speaking, Ronald, what more can the West do besides imposing sanctions. Yes, Russia can be excluded from pretty much every global financial institution in the world, but is that going to stop President Putin from attacking Ukraine?
I think the sanctions are largely useless. When it comes to if you understand your vital security interests, your own existential position, then the sanctions are irrelevant. And the West doesn't have a lot of positions. They're not going to send troops in here to stop this attack, and that's a real tragedy. Now,
so Ronald, if I may interject here, how would it stop? If you were advising the U.S. administration today, what would you tell them?
I would say let's call on the European powers, let's say Scholz and Macron and maybe some other leaders, to bring Russia to the table and start seriously talking about first an armistice and then an end to the war, and then some arrangement that can move beyond the current impasse that we have. That's possible.
Okay.
I always am quite optimistic about the possibilities. Some of them, of course, are not followed
Okay,
through.
Ronald, you have made a very interesting point. Let me put this to Richard. Richard, now, if I'm not mistaken, President Macron and many other European leaders did try getting President Putin and President Biden on a negotiating table. But it almost felt that President Putin was not interested in diplomacy anymore, because right when the United Nations countries were meeting, he launched an attack on Ukraine.
Yeah, that indeed is tragic. I very much support the moves made by Macron and Scholz. It was endless, and it was good attempts, but ultimately they put nothing on the table. I remember a couple of years ago, after Macron made his famous, excellent speech to French diplomats in August 2019, about the fact about we really do need to look at European security. I asked Sergei Lavrov about this in October that year, and Lavrov dismissed it. Why? Because he says, look, nothing is going to happen. There's going to be a lot of talk, but they will not actually engage with our substantive issues. And this is where we are today. And as for the idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine, this means the Third World War. It'll mean Russian planes fighting US planes. So the Ukrainians have been pushing this to the edge and beyond for 6 years. It really is something time for the West to stand back. And indeed, I absolutely agree that we need a European powers to declare the need for a European conference, a security where everything is on the table. Everything, not just simply old statements of just how good we are and how bad you are on both sides, but a genuine attempt to say, okay, let's sort out the Crimean issue. The Crimean population wants to stay with Russia.
Okay.
In the Donbass, I know many people, and they, of course, are delighted about what's been going on. 4 million people delighted about what's been going on of the last 2 days. Again, I don't justify the invasion, but we have to understand how we got to this position.
Okay. Ronald, how do we move forward from this point? Given the current circumstances, Ukraine has severed diplomatic ties with Russia. So certainly we cannot expect any diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine at this point, right? Given the current circumstances, how do you think the European Union and countries like the United States, how do you think they can persuade President Putin to end this?
I don't think they have much leverage now. The chances for those kinds of decisions have been lost. I think Putin is now determined to go to Kiev, overthrow the government, and put in some kind of puppet regime. This is a really tragic situation because occupation and control of Ukraine, it seems to me, without lots of violence, a kind of police state, is really impossible. And so, in some ways, Putin has put himself into a trap, and the West has been caught totally flat-footed.
Right. Ron, we are in the dying minutes of the program. I would like to ask you one more question here. Assuming the worst-case scenario, if Kiev falls to Russia, what kind of implications is it going to have for the wider region?
It makes the case for NATO, unfortunately, stronger in the countries on the border. I can see Sweden and Finland, which have been thinking about joining NATO, probably moving now in that direction. Again, we're headed toward a new Iron Curtain, a new Cold War. years and years of instability. This is very unfortunate. And I don't think blame is on a single side. I think, as Richard has indicated, it's been a long time coming. And Putin then, finally pulled the trigger.
All right, Ronald Suny and Richard Sakwa, thank you very much for talking to us here on the Newsmakers today. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.